Hello and welcome to the first episode of Robot Wars: The Big Question. In this particular type of video, we will typically have two guests and they will be fighting their corner over a highlighted topic about the show. The guests for our debut episode come in the form of Toon Ganondorf.
Hello.
And Theo.
Hello.
So, two good guests along with us here to open up things. The big question itself, though, each episode will consist of one specific subject, and both guests will be going over to their specific side from that question. It's as simple as that. It's going to be basically a free-for-all. Anyone can say anything, but we are going to have an agenda to follow. There'll be specific topics which we'll branch off to, and we'll have a little debate for a couple of minutes, up to 5 minutes each time. So anyway, today we are going to start with something that has been an interesting talking point for a while now, and that is the active weapon rule. So most people should know about this, but for those who are just tuning in casually, TG, what is the active weapon rule mainly all about?
The active weapon rule, it was brought in as a major weapons restriction in Series 7, and there's information about it mostly brought to light when Ed Hoppert posted the allegations of favouritism against Storm 2 in Series 7 and Extreme 2. The rule was for all middleweight and higher robots had to have a working offensive weapon of some kind. That was intended to exclude robots that had non-moving weapons, so static spikes, scoops, wedges, rambots, even spearbots like Spikosaurus, that kind of thing. Had to be a moving weapon of some kind that moved independently of the robot's, locomotion. It's never been confirmed, but it's widely suspected that it was designed to counter the new wave of Tornado Storm 2 robots. And that was ultimately what the producers allegedly were restricting. The quote in question was from an old Mentorn blog, which has since been lost. But essentially, the audience want to see, wow, Rambots just don't have that appeal. Robots with moving weapons, there's a sense of theatre and drama, sparks from a flywheel or flying from the air from a flipper. Push and shove, they win the battle, but does not win our imaginations or the fans.
Yeah, and that's basically what it is about. But so Toon Ganondorf himself, he's a man who you'll see largely tends to agree with the Mentorn quote there.
Love the active weapon rule.
And Theo, on the other hand, is a bit of the opposite. So, to start things off, we're going to go with TG first. Can you give a brief overview of why you hold the opinion you do on the active weapon rule?
Can I give an opinion? Yes. Can I give a brief opinion? Possibly. Let's see.
A brief opinion for this specific segment, let's say.
Let's see. My issue with the active weapon rule and my agreement with it stems sort of in twofold. One is that I completely agree with the characterization of what makes an interesting robot. Big weapons, big personalities, big fights. And I can acknowledge that there are some Rambot fights that are exciting, but for the most part, the lack of active weapon diminishes robots to competitive titanium bricks that are just not fun to watch. The other part of the reason why I'm for this rule, and it's a lesser but just as important factor, and that is that I believe the controversy over the active weapon rule is extraordinarily overblown due to the exposure we have to certain bits of information. And also because we know what happened in this timeline, in an alternate timeline, the show could have been suffocatingly worse, and that's something I'll touch on later. But the crux of my argument is I don't think that the show is any worse off. In fact, I think that the show is significantly better off because we have this rule enforced to prevent dozens and dozens of Storm 2 tornado robots flooding Series 7.
Yeah. Okay, and Theo, your basic thoughts on things as well?
So my issue with the active weapon rule is it wasn't necessary. For example, Storm 2 and even Tornado, honestly, they were both interesting to watch. You know, Storm 2's Ota flip of the Steel Avenger demonstrates that. And also Tornado, while the interchangeable weaponry was a good addition, that scoop, those fights are still really fun to watch. Like, look at Anarchy versus Tornado and the static spike. That was good. And also, I believe that active weaponry in itself is a good thing. But for example, Thwapbots. Thwapbots, they're interesting. They have a weapon, but that's a class that I feel was neglected somewhat. Stinger. I always loved watching Stinger. Even original Sin, honestly, in America. I know that was post Series 7, but wedge bots can be really interesting, but that's something they didn't see, I believe.
Okay. Good opening things from both of you. Thank you. So, let's get into some specific categories, shall we? So, the first thing I'm going to bring up is how strongly should the active weapon rule be followed? Obviously, on the show, we had machines allowed into the arena, such as Crackers and Smash, and those fights became controversial afterwards from viewers and from people inside the show itself, from unnecessary feedback as such. So, should it aim to ban purely wedges from entering the arena, or should it be more opposed to just catering to a specific type of robot? Because in Series 7 we obviously lost Stinger and instead got Tornado with a flail over its wedge instead. So do you need to, if you want to make the active weapon rule really good, do you need to really be hard and fast on it? Or do you think there is room for interpretation, but you just need to try and nail it down? It's an awkward one to think about, really.
I believe that the active weapon rule should be enforced up to the qualification stage, and if you're damaged, then you're damaged. Because I don't see any reason why Crackers and Smash should be punished because their weapon was carbided in the previous fight. They're already being punished enough because their robot was carbided in the previous fight. Why would you then not risk disqualifying them over that? My point on it is to get the right robots to qualify for the show. I would rather take Series 7, I would be much happier seeing more robots with flippers and flywheels than more Tornado and Storm 2 clones. And that's the thing people often forget, is that I'm not talking about Tornado and Storm 2. I'm talking about the crappy clones of Tornado and Storm 2. Because every champion ends up with clones. We get Chaos 2 clones, ranging from the successful ones like Spawn Again and Bigger Brother, right down to the crappy ones like Colossus. You get Razor clones, ranging from Ming 3 and Tiberius and Suicidal Tendencies, round down to the crappier ones like Pinsir. I don't want the Storm 2, Typhoon 2 clones, which are basically, funnily enough that you say it, basically Crackers and Smash, which, when you take their weapons away, they're just little metal bricks that don't have any weapons and are not fun to watch. So, whilst I don't think we should enforce it amongst the heat, because a robot's had its weapon broken, that's just a dumb thing for me, I think we should be keeping out robots that don't offer any wow factor to the audience, because it just doesn't make it fun to watch. And that's why we get Robot Wars cancelled.
It's a good point. Theo, do you have any rebuttal to that?
Well, those are some good points. I was a little bit triggered on your comments about Pinsir, but we'll let bygones be bygones.
I realised that I couldn't think of any bad crushes, so I was thinking Pinsir will just have to do.
I mean, you've always got Mantis, but I digress.
You do digress. Mantis is so much better than Pinsir.
Agree to disagree. Anyway, the active weapon rule, I think it does have its merits. I will admit, but it shouldn't be enforced like it was in Series 7, where even thwack bots weren't considered. For example, Series 4, the qualification method of Series 4 and I think 5 was good because even, say, pushers like Danton Kia, Mark 1, that won a battle, but that wasn't interesting and they didn't let it in. And I think that was a great system because that way you could add in some robots without active weapons, but they're still interesting, such as Storm 2. Because we can all agree that was good to watch.
I don't agree.
And, well...
Here we go, first can of worms opened.
Oh, okay.
Finish your thought, then we'll get on to the Storm 2. I think Storm 2 and Stinger are really the two biggest points to raise in this.
Exactly, but also... Yes, having robots with no active weapons is a bad idea. I think that's false because in Series 7 you got a lot of flippers, you got a lot of other robots, flywheels, you got bloody Jackson Wallop instead, and they weren't very good. With a Rambot, you can focus all of your attention on that drive system. You can make it good, you can make it reliable, you can make it balanced. That's good. But when you just bodge a weapon on it, that's not good. You're not focusing on it. That's why there were so many crap, especially spinners in Series 7. Yes, you got more robots with active weapons, but they weren't good robots. I think that's one of the key reasons Series 7 it was cancelled for Series 7. You know?
Well, it's an interesting point. I think that a series of unreliable Rambots would be just as boring as a series of half-baked in both directions. Like, it's very easy to say, they were so busy building an active weapon they forgot to make it good driving. But I feel like that's a cop-out because we had six series where people had to focus on, were able to focus on both, and they managed it fine. I don't think that's really should come into it. You can't sort of say, oh, my robot would be better if I didn't have to focus on building a weapon. That doesn't follow. A good roboteer should be able to build both, like Ian Lewis and Simon Scott, and like George Francis, and like the Rose brothers. Like, people are able to do both. It shouldn't be making excuses for oneself by saying, oh, I have a good robot, but unfortunately I have to build a weapon, and now, I've ended up with Colossus.
You say that, but from experience, there is a balance you've got to throw in there. It's not if you have only the drive to focus on, like my first featherweight, then that's good because you can focus all of your attention on perfecting that. But if you've got to put a weapon in the picture.
So you're basically saying that there you get that starting point to build up from then.
Yeah, but
yeah,
I think that's a good point. I think that's a very good point in the modern day. But back in Series 7, a lot of these teams were established teams, and those that weren't, maybe they should have been starting in the lower weight classes where the active weapon rule was not enforced. There was the Series 7 featherweight tournament was there for a reason. If they were uncomfortable building a heavyweight, then they should have done that. But I think Robot Wars for Series 1 to 7, not so much with the reboot, was all about amateurs just building something. And we had glimpses of it in the reboot where people tried to say, oh, we're just here to show that you can do this. But without exception, those robots ended up being very bad anyway. So, but back then, it was possible to scrape together a robot and actually do okay. I don't think that's so much of a problem. People were able to self-teach, and they were able to self-teach fine, focusing on drive and weapon both. I think something I want to sort of touch on, just to follow on from that, and something I flagged earlier, is imagine we get a Series 8 in 2004, where every episode has got one or two Storm 2 clones, which are just really thick titanium bricks with bad reception, and, vulnerable wheels, essentially. Like, you imagine a Series 8 in 2004, which is just full of crackers and Sweeney Todd. Like, that's the timeline that I don't want, is where we end up with just terrible robot fights because Mr. Nasty versus Sweeney Todd, and one of them breaks down. I would much rather someone put effort into a robot like 259, a robot like, Kill a Carrot, build a flipper based around a carrot. Like, that's hilarious. Build a Rambot based around a carrot. It's not that fun. Like, that's where sort of the creativity, by rewarding Rambots who bring things down, it goes against the spirit of the show. And it goes back to that Mentor quote. It's all about entertainment. I want to be entertained. My favourite robots are, like, from the reboot, Apollo, big flipper; Aftershock, big flywheel; Concussion, big drum; Behemoth, big scoop. Like, they're big weapons. Whereas Storm 2, to touch on that, is excruciating to watch because it's so dominant. And I find it's exactly the same as Carbide in Series 9. There was no prospect of anyone beating it because it had no weapons weight in Extreme 2 for its weapon. In Series 7, it barely used the weapon, so it didn't have to worry about making its weapon powerful or reliable. It just had 6 wheels, a monster of power, and it just stormed through everything, and there was no fun. There was no threat. It took a controversial grand final for anyone to beat it. So that's why I think it's dull.
Yeah, so you're basically saying that with even though it's good to have a base to build up Rambots from, if you make them too good, they can be overly dominant without a foil as such.
I think Theo's point about the rule not being necessary and just weeding the crap ones out in the qualifiers is a really good point, and I think it's a very valid one. But for me, I don't think it's a big ask that people just remember the spirit of the show, build the whole robot, and don't reward dragging the sport down to ultimately what the biggest criticism is metal boxes bumping into each other. Like, why risk losing it? It's such a small ask, and the biggest one that everyone mentions is Stinger. Well, how competitive would Stinger have really been in Series 7? Not very, I don't think. I would rather have lost Stinger and the unnamed masses of crappy Rambots that we might have otherwise got. I feel like that's a fair trade. I'm happy to lose Stinger, who would probably have lost in round 1 to something like, Hellbent or Mean Streak, heaven forbid. Like some Series 7 spinners were just capable of beating Stinger at that point in time, and I just don't see it being there. And I would be happy to swap out that one Stinger fight to enforce the rule.
That's fair enough. Theo, so obviously now we know that you where you stand on the active weapon rule, but at the same time, we do want to always try and maintain the balance in the show. So what would you suggest as an alternative to the active weapon rule to make sure that the show doesn't become this monopolised Rambot fest? Because even though they can have value, they also don't want to be the main attraction to the show as well. So what do you suggest would be done in a situation if you did let Rambots get out of control? What would you do then when, say, 60% of the field could then turn into Rambots? Is the active weapon rule something that came in at the right time before things got out of control? Or do you think that there could have been a different way to go about it?
I'd say, as I was saying before, the Series 5 and 4 qualification method was really good, in my opinion, because you could get good Rambots that were boring, such as Danton Kia, and you could leave them out.
Yeah, but at the same time, if the viewing audience, who are also going to be Roboteers at the time, if they are influenced by the most dominant type of robot on the show at the time, are you going to get to the stage where, say, 70% of the robots trying to qualify are Rambots, so you can only turn down a certain amount? what would you do at that stage?
Well,
Storm 2 didn't have to qualify. It was already in. And, like, what do you do for seeds who... what happens if the Scutterbots boys want to turn to respawn again and it's just a big black box? Like, you can't kick them out because they're seeds.
In all fairness, though, Storm 2 did have quite a big build-up in the New Blood competition, so I wouldn't say that's probably a fair example. But I suppose when you're building a robot, it's what I learned. There's such a big community, and if everyone's saying that if you build a Rambot, you won't qualify. For example, like the featherweight championships this year and last year, you could enter a Rambot, but it just wouldn't get in, and you were told, don't bother. You may as well put a weapon
you're
on
arguing that there's always going to be variety just because that's the nature of the Roboteers' minds as such.
Exactly. So but even back then, they did have forums. And ways to talk. So although if 60% of the field would be Rambots qualifying, and maybe the production crew would only pick a few of those, and then people could go home and say, look, don't build Rambots, you won't get in.
It's not worth the risk as such.
And as we've seen that's happened before with different weight classes.
Yeah,
and
so you think that the active weapon rule isn't necessarily something that's there, it's just one that they don't need to put it there as like a set in stone rule, it's more something that just needs to be kept an eye on more than anything.
My response to that is, alright, you keep out the crappy Rambots and the crappy Thwackbots and the T-Rexes of the world, but what happens when your top 4 is the 2 best Rambots in the competition, and ultimately, Exterminator, who's got the most exciting, like one of the most exciting run-ups in the series, just gets mullered by a titanium brick like Tornado because it can't do anything to it. Like it's not only the bottom end where you get all the crap, it's also the top end where no one can beat these robots because they just ultimately they regress into these titanium bricks with 0.5 millimeter ground clearance and 6-wheel drive. There's ultimately no way to beat that except if you get them flipped out of the arena. And I think if in an alternate dark timeline where Storm 2 wins Series 8 and 9 in 2004 and 5, where people are just really sick of it, it's like the carbide fatigue. You just get sick of something that keeps winning, and they brought in entanglement devices to try and stop carbide. They barely succeeded. They had to bring in something to stop this. I just think it's a good thing they tried to do it ahead of time.
Honestly, I have to say that's the nature of the sport, right? We find a dominant class, and we find a weakness for it. Then they become dominant. Then we find a weakness for them, and that's how things have progressed. That's how things have progressed over time. And so maybe you would have had a series or two of Rambots being dominant, but you would find alternatives. You'd find counters for them.
What is the best counter for a Rambot? Is there a best counter for a Storm 2 type? Because we all know Apollo was the only one who's ever beaten Storm 2 uncontroversially. And even then, that was because Storm 2 was so reduced in speed. So again, it was Storm 2 being restricted was what led it. If Storm 2 was in its Series 7 levels of speed and power, I don't think Storm 2 could have lost Series 8 in the reboot. And that would have just been very depressing.
I suppose Storm 2 in the reboot, again, it does show how good they can be, but it's, as we were saying before, a decent counter for a Rambot like Storm 2. Wedgelets, they're good. They can counter a full-on plow. A vertical spinner with wedgelets, that would be a decent counter. And again, as we've seen in the live scene, that does work against Rambots. But I think again that's how robots progress. That's how things become the new meta, and that's how other classes then become the new meta, and it goes on and on. I suppose. And so, but something else I'd like to just bring up would be Thwackbots, because they have a weapon. They have you've seen Gabriel that can actually do damage. I've seen again at live events, but also on the show. And they're really good robots. Gabriel was really entertaining to watch, in my opinion, and that didn't have an active weapon necessarily.
Can't
Stinger?
Gabriel articulate without the torque reaction like Stinger? Like Gabriel can move on its own axle, can't it?
Yeah, Gabriel definitely did like twitch and twiddle with its weapon on the spot once or twice. But I get the general thing of what you're trying to say. If you try and limit Thwackbots to just being Gabriel only type things, then it's a bit of an unfair disadvantage for them. Is that what you're mainly trying to say?
Look, Gabriel did have a weird clutch thing with its wheels, so it'd get some torque reaction, but then it would cut out, so it wouldn't. Like you see, in live events, they don't bother with that, so it jitters around much more when they're using the axe.
Yeah,
but I think my point was that Thwackbots and robots without active weapons can still be entertaining in their own right, even if they're not just your average wedge.
Yeah. Just to quickly go back to the thing you said about vertical spinners and wedgelets, these are type of machines that have really come to the fore in the modern day more. You see BattleBots, there's numerous vertical spinners. There's recently just been a rumble with 3 vertical spinners in one fight. So in the modern day, in 2018, TG, do we think the active weapon rule for wedges isn't starting to be outdated by now? The obviously, as you yourself mentioned, the lack of wedges essentially allowed Carbide to dominate Series 9 and try to add entanglement. So now spinners are becoming so powerful and destructive. Doesn't putting up wedges against them essentially create exciting fights themselves, like we saw Cobra versus Sabretooth, and we see Original Sin against Last Rites in America, and Stinger versus whatever in BattleBots. Is there not a place now in the modern day for these type of machines, or do you think this is something that still needs to be kept on top of even in 2018?
Yes and no. I think that my agenda has always been that Series 7 was better because of the active weapon rule. Because I couldn't fathom the thought of Tornado versus Storm 2 both being weaponless boxes. Just the thought of that was excruciating. And I don't think that back then the vertical spinners were enough. Like you saw Hypnodisc versus Tornado, and Exterminator versus Tornado, and all those sorts of spinners failed to do anything. Now, something like Aftershock, or something of similar design and power, and Carbide certainly, would definitely be able to contend. So Storm 2 versus Carbide would definitely be an interesting fight. So it's not so important in these days as it was back then. Back then it was all about, this is getting away from us. People have realised that this is what they can do if they want to win.
Yeah.
And that's what I was more about. Today, I would be okay backing off on it, but I still think that the spirit of Robot Wars is creating something that's big and entertaining, and get yourself an Apollo-style flipper or an Aftershock-style flywheel. Like, be creative, make your flipper your iconic bit. Don't make your iconic nature just your flat metal side panels, or something like that.
Don't rely on the other robot to make the fight interesting. Essentially,
I ask you, and I ask the listeners: name one iconic robot where it's the first thing you think of isn't its weapon. And obviously, obviously Storm 2 and Tornado, take those sort of with a grain of salt. But aside from those, if you think of any robot, one of the first 2 things you're going to think of is going to be, what was its weapon? And that's the spirit of the show. So I don't think that we should embrace a culture where wedges are great. Let's stick on 3 solid inches of hard ox and just build a 6-wheel brick that rams into everything. But yeah, don't embrace that culture, but we don't have to enforce it like we used to.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So, Theo, as TG has hinted on a couple of times now, robot combat on TV is and always will be primarily for entertainment and to continue to draw in the viewers. So, as you've said yourself, you always want the best to come to the top. But is that something that should more be promoted for live events where you don't need to rely on the audience watching all the time to keep the show alive? And is for the TV, is it always just going to be hard for wedges to win over the casual fans? Like, how do you convince the casual fans that wedges are worth their time when people when people get to the end of BattleBots or Robot Wars and they reminisce on them for why they got cancelled, everybody always seems to say, well, it just diverged into wedges and who was the lowest to the ground, and that's what people ultimately take away from it. And is that ultimately something which also hurt the reboot, that people thought that they were just going to get reintroduced to those precision milled ways that the show came to an end back in the day? Like, how do you get away from that negative mentality around wedges? You can find personal entertainment for them, but are they just something that doesn't have enough wow factor about them and never will do?
That's the thing. You can't get away from that, really, because at the end of the day, the sport is about precision milled, low to the ground wedges. That ultimately wins fights these days. And I suppose the thing is, drawing in an audience is crucial to the sport, because if we have less audience members, we have less live events, less events to go to, and then things wind down. So it is important to have wedges. I think, so a casual viewer on TV, they might not be very important. But that goes back to my point on, you can let the interesting ones in, maybe hold off on the less so. But
yeah, even then, wedges themselves, do they then breed into other weapon types? Like, people's complaints weren't necessarily always just about wedges. It was even towards flippers themselves being influenced by wedges, because to breach wedges, do flippers then get made into this kind of more boring, methodical way of you are lower to the ground, instead of back in the day when you could have had interesting things like Cassius just charging around the arena? Do wedges negatively then influence other weapon types as well and make them just as streamlined?
Oh god, no! Wedges are crucial to the sport. I'll say, because you're saying that they have their place in live events, and they do. But one thing I would say is, and it's my complaint with the reboot, is they showed too many amazing bots. I suppose if you had a robot with a wedge that was built on a low budget, it would inspire viewers to think, I'll have a go at this robot crap.
That's true. That's true in a way.
But if you look at all the famous builders, you've got Dave Mould. You look at all of them. Their first robot, even Team Invade Eruption, their first robot was a Rambot. And so wedges and Rambots, when robots without an active weapon, they're good because they're the starting ground for the sport. And through that, you can then put a weapon on. You can then think further, and you've got a grasp for things, and then you get Eruption from all of that eventually. So
that's true.
I'd say wedges on TV are really good, and I think because we didn't have many of them in the reboot, or any, that's put off viewers. That's put off people from entering the sport, which will actually have negative effects in the long run.
Yeah,
so
I can see why.
And so I suppose we needed representation in the new series. They didn't even necessarily need to be good wedges. We just needed some more variation to show viewers you can do this too.
More spotlight for things like Cobra, are you saying?
Less for spinners.
Exactly. Once send a message. Yeah. Once send a message that, like the original series did, that you can do it. Anyone can do this.
Yeah.
Rather than you need to be minted engineers.
Yeah, I suppose, like TG has hinted on, you always want to encourage people to be at the root of the show with the identity of it. But also, do you always want that new blood eager to join in by promoting wedges at the same time. I do see what you're saying. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a hard balance. It
we
always
need new
is.
blood, and wedges are the new blood.
Yeah,
But then that develops.
that's a good point.
And as I think when you were saying before that, you see a viewer thinking, I want to build this brilliant flipper. They don't do that. As someone who watched a reboot,
They don't see it as viable because it's
exactly as
yeah.
someone who watched a reboot and then decided to get into robots. My first thought wasn't I'm going to build this great spinner. It was I'm going to build a robot.
Yeah, if
And
you
then we'll
I
see where it
suppose if
comes
you
from
have a
there.
whole competition of Apollos looking amazing, you just feel like you're never going to get the chance to ever try and
That's exactly
emulate that.
Yeah, definitely. But through that, we've intimidated lots of viewers from actually building robots. They think, oh, it's too hard. I'm not good enough. It's too expensive.
I think that might be sort of a conversation for another day where we talk about how cancelling the featherweight tournament of Series 10 was such a bad thing.
Oh God.
Yeah, because back in the classic series when everyone was building pieces of shit, and everyone was on the same wavelength. Like I was about to say before, I'm like, well, that's all very well and good, but to keep using the same examples again, Hypnodisc started with Hypnodisc, and they were one of the most famous robots of all time. Like,
Yeah.
there were lots of people whose first robot was the one that we all know. Obviously, engineering has advanced so much now that you can't jump in with a heavyweight like you used to be able to. But that's, again, a conversation for another day. I don't think that embracing rambots, and when we talk about wedges, I only mean static wedges like Storm 2 and Tornado. I don't think embracing wedges is the right thing. And to sum up sort of that point, I remember talking with Toast about how can Carbide ever beat how can Eruption ever beat Carbide? And he said they should just convert the flipper into a Hardox wedge and have the stupid little drum at the top to get past the active weapon rule. And I thought to myself, that's at the time, I said, that is probably the only way they can beat them. And wouldn't that just be the most depressing thing you have ever seen? Like, just embracing that. Like, I don't care for Eruption or Carbide, but I'm so glad that Eruption won their victory the way that it did. Like, with its actual flipper. Like, I wouldn't have had it any other way.
going with the philosophy it's used to, as opposed to adapting to.
Yeah, getting down into the gutter, basically.
I honestly I wouldn't say Eruption won because of that. As we've seen, it's a long explanation, but long story short, after the Gabriel fight, Carbide had taken some serious internal damage, and in the fight, in the fight, Eruption was just ramming into it for a lot of it, and that was weakening Carbide bit by bit. And so
That's fair enough.
That was a great comeback story. Eruption going up through the 10-way melee and becoming champion. That was great. That was entertaining for the audience, and that happened because it mostly used wedge tactics.
Oh, well, good stuff so far, lads. So we are coming on to 40 minutes now. Not necessarily a bad thing. First episode, we always want to air as much as we can, but I think we'll try to wrap it up now just while we can. Keep a lid on things. So I just want both of you guys, starting with TG, to just give your overall rounded thoughts on things and what we've discussed so far. So, back in the day, modern day, everything. Go for it.
I think that the active weapon rule was blown so much into prominence by, and some fault lies obviously with me and my fellow editors, the wiki. And that was because we all had the Storm 2 website and we published it. And that was the only place anyone went to read things. And you see that so much with the wiki is, aside from the sort of little murmurs and mutters that people spread crap about unsubstantiated rumours, the wiki is usually where people get information, and it makes things higher profile than they would otherwise have been. And so the Storm 2 controversy, and even something like T-Rex, like, you talk to people just generally on Facebook, in the Facebook comments and the YouTube comments, and you see people talk about T-Rex like it's the Antichrist. And I think it's only because the wiki made such constant references to the fact that it managed to get past the rule that people hate it so much. And I think that if people didn't know so much about it, and I put a little bit of blame here with Ed Hoppert, because he had this big allegation section on his website for so long, and there wasn't a balanced response from Mentorn or from Typhoon or from anybody, people took it as fact for so long that the active weapon rule became this representation of producer interference, where I think it was a legitimately good thing that got swung up with, the allegations of favoritism, which are its own separate thing. I don't think the active weapon rule is a controversial or bad thing on itself. I feel sad for a day where Thermidor 2 loses to a Hardox Mr. Nasty, where we get, the title fight is Tornado versus Storm 2 every single time. That's what I don't want. And for me, the moment that I was cemented on the active weapon rule is when Apollo beat Carbide. Apollo beat Storm 2 in Series 8. Because Storm 2, until that point, had only lost a single controversial fight. And so to see it beaten fair and square in that heat final by Apollo was, to me, everything Robot Wars should be about. Big personalities, fun teams, huge weapons, beating the titanium bricks that are there to win. And for me, that's when I said, this is what it's about. And I think if every robot is told you have to put in some effort into being a big weapon and not just trying to win, try to have fun and to entertain, I think mandating entertainment value is a good thing.
Fair enough. Good points all round, my Australian man. So, Theo, do you want to help close things off then for us?
Okay. K Sarasa Bloody Ra. Mr. Nasty beat Thermidor 2. Alright, it used its spike. That wasn't an active weapon, but it was a weapon rather than just a wedge.
Wait, when did Mr. Nasty beat Thermidor 2?
It's just a situation is brought up. Especially
I thought you were talking about it in reality. I was going to say.
Thermidor 2's reality, I wouldn't put it past. Reliability, I wouldn't put it past them. So.
Oh no. But the point is that robots without an active weapon aren't just wedges. There's so much variation. You can have a weapon for a robot without an active weapon. But going back, I think in the end, a competition dominated by wedges isn't interesting. In all honesty, it's boring. You get America, where most of their fights, especially the smaller live events, are just D2s, just wedges, and that is so boring and dreary. Don't want to do it. However, I think for the sake of the sport in general, there should at least be representation of all the classes, rather than even if you're allowing crap rambots or robots with active weapons.
You always want that base there, you're saying.
Exactly. You want representation, mainly for the sake of the sport, but also they're entertaining to watch. And hey, they're in the Overdoser. Even without that weapon, if you can call it a weapon, that was fun to watch get decimated. So I suppose representation is all I want, rather than to be ultra strict on the rule.
Yep. Well, lads, that was a very, very enjoyable 45 minutes or so now. Yes, that's perfectly fine. That was really, 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 really educational. A lot of good points brought up by both of you. And I think it's a good point to end things at. We'll leave the rest to be discussed in the comments by you guys listening to this. But anyway, thank you, TG, for coming along.
Thank you.
Thank you, Theo, for also being the foil.
Thank you for letting me be here.
That's okay. It was a really enjoyable episode, guys. Good job. And I hope everyone listening to this enjoys it. So we will see you guys again soon. Feel free to suggest whatever you want to see debated between a couple of our regulars on the podcast next. And we will see you then.
Ta-ra.
So long.